Hi, this is Michael Paul, New Orleans Scottish Rite College. I want to continue the discussion today on the Symbolic Lodges of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite and touch a bit on the 16th District of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, some of the lodges that are in that district and their history, and give you an idea a little bit of how the district is organized and the lodge is organized. What I think I should first mention is that so much of pre-1850 Louisiana Masonic history has giant holes all throughout it. And what this is there's a great loss of many of the documents and records and minutes and so forth. And there's many areas that we just simply don't fully understand. And I want to take a moment and explain a little bit about how we deal today with missing history and how it's been dealt with in the past and some of the problems that we've had. If you have an event that happened here and an event that happened later on, and both of these events are documented and you can prove it, but the events that happened in the middle are obscure and there's no records, historians are faced with the problem of how do you tell the whole story if you have middle areas that are missing. What competent historians do is they'll look at an entire situation and they'll take what they can prove and they'll use that as anchor points. And the areas that are gray or missing or misunderstood, they'll try to analyze based on the people, the events, the times, and they'll try to form a conclusion based mainly on logic. But what they'll do is they'll give a best guess. We believe that this, and this happened, and their reason will be given. We believe it happened because of these events. Sometimes you can have historians disagree on what happened, and that's fine because it's all opinion. It's based on what they think happened. The only time you run into trouble is when a historian does not have evidence and cannot prove it, and he does the proper procedure of giving a best guess, but then reports it as a fact rather than an opinion. That's where sometimes we've run into problems in the past where things are missing or unknown, and a historian will say as fact this happened or this happened, and then future historians try to piece together the puzzle and things are missing, and these misstatements, whether they are simply because the historian was not qualified or whether he didn't have the best intentions or whatever the reason, they cause problems in our understanding, and it causes everything that the historian says to be questioned, and this sometimes can create a mountain of problems and a snowballing effect. In a future video, we'll explore the very unfortunate times around 1850 in the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and the divisions that ended up with a second Grand Lodge being created and an almost war between two cultures and ideas of what Masonry should be, but we'll save that for another time. The point of mentioning this was that much of what happened later on, our understanding of the early years of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana is sometimes colored by what happened later on. And to get a clear picture, we have to separate ourselves from any form of judgment on which is the proper form of Masonry, which is not proper form, and just simply look at what happened. Now, if we look at the 16th District Lodges, the oldest lodge is Etoile number 1. And really, that lodge has a history where it should, to do it justice, it should have its own video regarding its history, and this probably will come later on down the line. But if we look at the history, and the immediate question that comes out is the fact that it's Etoile number 1. And the reason is there are two lodges under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge that have the number 1, Perfect Union number 1 and Etoile number 1. And the question always comes, why? Why do you have two lodges that carry the number 1? There is a situation that is somewhat like an onion. You can explain why Etoile Palea carries the number 1, but it only really leads to further questions, and what that is. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana, in its very early days, from everything that we can objectively see, had more of a European attitude towards the lodges and towards Masonry in general. By that I mean it took pretty much a hands-off attitude towards the lodges under its jurisdiction. And as long as the lodges paid their yearly returns, for example, the ritual that the lodge chose to work, that was pretty much left to the lodge to decide. And as most things were left, matters of the lodge were left to the jurisdiction of the lodge. Now, as Louisiana developed, the 5 lodges that created it were French-speaking, and that was reflective of the time in Louisiana. Much of the city was French. It was founded by the French, and in later years, Albert Pike, when he came to New Orleans to study law, he had to prove that he could read and write in French in order to be able to get a license to practice law. Everything was French, so it was not surprising that the Grand Lodge would be created by 5 French-speaking lodges. Over the years, more and more English-speaking, what they were called Americans, you had the Americans and the Creoles, the French-speaking Creoles. There was a clash of cultures, and in the society it ended up with a major struggle, and in Masonry was reflective of this same struggle. The divisions that created in the Grand Lodge were along lines of English-speaking and French-speaking. In the 1830, it ended up with the Grand Lodge realizing that something was necessary to be done in order to accommodate and explain why there were various rituals. And the result was that the Grand Lodge made a change in how it issued charters and would supervise the lodges. It created what was known as the Chamber of Rites. This rite would supervise the 3, at that time, rituals that were authorized by the Grand Lodge, and that was the York Rite ritual, the Scottish Rite ritual, and the French Rite ritual. All 3 of these were worked by lodges. And this Chamber of Rites was made up of individuals who were knowledgeable in each of the particular rites, and they would supervise the lodges. This Chamber of Rites, by the way, in 1850, it was disbanded, and not really disbanded, it was shed of its Scottish Rite and French Rite elements, and it was remodeled, and it actually exists today as the Permanent Committee on Work, but it supervises only the York Rite ritual. Along with the changes that were made was a change in charters that were issued. All previous charters were issued by the Grand Lodge as York Rite charters for lodges. So the lodges had York Rite charters regardless of what ritual they used. And this was the same in the early days for the Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge had always had organized itself as a York Rite Grand Lodge, but there's evidence that the early Grand Lodge, that there was no York Rite French language ritual in Louisiana at that time. There's no evidence at all that anything existed. In fact, the York Rite ritual that we have today wasn't hammered out until around 1816. So in the early days, it's very possible that even though the Grand Lodge itself organized itself as a York Rite Grand Lodge, it didn't actually work a York Rite ritual. The same for the lodges under its jurisdiction. But in 1833, the Grand Lodge made the offer to lodges that they could keep their original York Rite charter or they could exchange it for either a Scottish Rite Charter or a French Rite Charter. Etoile Polaire put its hand up and says, well, we'll take a Scottish Rite Charter. So Etoile Polaire number 5 became Etoile Polaire number 1, and that was reflective of its Scottish Rite Charter. Now, the only other lodge that carries the old remnants of the Scottish Rite Charter is Cervantes number 5. They were not originally issued the number 5. The number 5 is reflective of their Scottish Rite Charter that was issued to Los Amigos de la Orden, and then later in the 1880s they merged with Silencio Lodge to create Cervantes, and they kept number 5. So the two lodges under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, which have numbers reflecting their former Scottish Rite Charters, are Etoile Polaire number 1 and Cervantes number 5. And all charters in 1850, when the change came, were reissued. So today all of the lodges have York Rite Charters, regardless of the fact that the 16th District lodges work in the Scottish Rite ritual. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana was created in 1812 by 5 French-speaking lodges. Now, in the order of their numbers, their original numbers, this would be Perfect Union number 1, Charity number 2, Concord number 3, Perseverance number 4, and Etoile Polaire or Polar Star number 5. When I mentioned the onion, this is pretty much what I'll explain now. Understanding the fact that Etoile Polaire was issued the number 5 at the time of the creation of the Grand Lodge, and that it was issued the number 1 as the first lodge to receive a Scottish Rite Charter, does not fully explain the situation. And I'll go into that a little bit. Now, when the Grand Lodge was created, it was the 5 French-speaking lodges that created it. But the year earlier, there was a convention held, and this convention was to decide on organizing. There was a realization that Louisiana was going to become a state in the Union, and they wanted to organize a Grand Lodge. So the reports that we have say that the 7 regular lodges in the New Orleans area were invited to this convention. There were 2 additional lodges that were invited. That was Louisiana Lodge number 1, which held a charter under the Grand Lodge of New York, and Harmony Lodge number 122, which held a charter under the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. Both of these lodges were English-speaking lodges. So these 7 lodges got together to discuss the creation of the Grand Lodge, and for reasons that we don't really understand, the 2 English-speaking lodges withdrew, and they did not participate in the creation of the Grand Lodge. Now, we're left with 2 problems. One is, why was Etoile Polaire issued number 5? What was the logic behind the number of when they organized? Why 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and what reason did they have for selecting those particular numbers? And the other question is, what do they mean by qualifying lodges, these 7 lodges, as the 7 regular lodges? That's something that's always bothered me, as it seems to suggest that if these were the 7 regular lodges, that there may have been other lodges in the area at that time which were for some reason not felt to be regular. So if we look back at the numbering, Perfect Union was organized in 1793 and it received it was originally organized under a Rose Croix charter, and this would have been the old Rite of Perfection Order of the Royal Secret. And in 1793 it received a charter from the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, and it became Perfect Union Lodge number 29. Etoile Polaire was the second oldest lodge. It received its charter, or it organized itself really, in 1794. And it petitioned the Grand Lodge of France for a charter. Now, a situation happened when the brother who traveled to France with the request for the charter, by the time he got to France, he realized that the Grand Lodge of France had broken apart. And he ended up several years later in 1798 receiving a charter from a provincial lodge, a provincial Grand Lodge in France, for a temporary charter, and it was issued under the number of 4293. In 1804, the final charter came for Étoile-Polaire from the Grand Orient of France. What happened was the lodge that the brother belonged to who requested the charter, his lodge had been a part of the Grand Lodge of France. When the Grand Lodge of France broke apart, his lodge became independent and then took part in the creation of the Grand Orient of France. So when he brought the request, the charter was issued through the Grand Orient of France. And it should be brought out that the Grand Orient of France at that time and in later years until the late 1800s was considered a very regular body. But that's when it received its charter. Charity Lodge number 2 received its charter in 1802 from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. Concord and Perseverance received their charters in 1810 from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania also. So we're left with trying to understand why was a lodge that was organized in 1794 given the number 5? Why was Étoile-Polaire not given the number 2? And in order to understand that, we need to look a little more at possibly what the Grand Lodge was trying to decide and do during that time. So if we look at the situation, it's understandable that Perfect Union was given the number 1 at the time of the creation of the Grand Lodge, and it was the oldest lodge in the New Orleans area, being created and organized in 1793. But why was Étoile-Polaire, the second oldest lodge, given the number 5 rather than the number 2? Why was it pushed down to the bottom, showing that it was the junior lodge? In looking at the situation, I believe that the answer to this question is similar to the answer of the regular lodges, other regular lodges. You see, there was one other lodge that we have hints of. In 1807, 2 Sovereign Grand Inspector Generals from the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica, were in New Orleans, and a craft lodge was created. Benevolence Lodge was created, number 1, under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica. 1809, a Lodge of Perfection was created. In 1811, these same brothers created a Grand Consistory. Now, this Grand Consistory exists today as the Valley of New Orleans. Questions about the Craft Lodge, however, have persisted. Now, this would have been the original Scottish Rite Craft Lodge. Étoile-Polaire, like Perfect Union, like most likely the 5 French-speaking lodges, would have worked in the old French Rite ritual, which would have been the foundation for the Rite of Perfection, as in the Bonseigneur rituals. This would have been the logical choice for the ritual they would have worked. It was there, it was available, it was in the French language, and it was probably the ritual that they worked. But no lodge prior to the creation of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite could have worked the craft rituals of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Étoile-Polaire at some point would have had to adopt the Scottish Rite ritual and modify its ritual from its original pre-1800 ritual that it had used. So from all indications, this 1807 lodge would have been the first actual Scottish Rite, ancient accepted Scottish Rite lodge in New Orleans. And questions have existed for a long time of how active it was, and was it active? But if it was active, why would they not include this lodge in the invitation for regular lodges? And the suggestion is that it was considered for some reason to be irregular. And that presents problems because the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica was considered perfectly regular, as the Grand Consistory, most of the founding members of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana were officers in the Grand Consistory. So why would that be considered an irregular body when it was all taking part in the same system? The only thing I can think of that might reflect was the Grand Lodge's early desire to be part of the United States. Etoile Polaire in 1811, for reasons that we do not have, left the jurisdiction of the Grand Orient of France and petitioned the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And at that time it received a charter from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania as Etoile Polaire, or Polar Star, number 129. With that charter, it became the junior lodge of those five, because its charter was 1811, a year before the creation of Grand Lodge. It seems to be the suggestion that there was a desire for all the lodges that created the Grand Lodge to possess charters from U.S. Grand Lodges. And while they did not consider the Grand Orient of France or the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica to be irregular, they were still outside the United States. It is possible that the Craft Lodge, under the Supreme Council of Jamaica, decided not to leave its jurisdiction and did not desire to seek a charter from a U.S. Grand Lodge. Therefore, it was excluded from the creation of the Grand Lodge. And Etoile Polaire would receive the number 5 because its charter from France was not counted. And its charter, being 1811, was junior than all of the other lodges. This would seem to suggest that the only thing that the early Grand Lodge was considering was its participation and working within the U.S. Masonic system. Even though there seems to have been a very clear and strong desire on the part of the early Grand Lodge of Louisiana to be part of the U.S. Masonic community, there seems to be a corresponding lack of awareness on the part of the Grand Lodge as to the exact nature of the U.S. Masonic community, or at least a lack of awareness that the practices in Louisiana were not conforming with the practices in the rest of the United States. This lack of awareness made the Grand Lodge of Louisiana almost like it was operating in something of a bubble. It was doing what it believed to be proper and what it knew to be as practiced in Europe, but was not translating to the standard practices as was in the rest of the United States. This did not seem to be a problem for the Grand Lodge itself, all the lodges under its jurisdiction, but it became a problem for those Masons who were coming into New Orleans and were viewing and visiting the lodges. Louisiana was becoming a larger port and becoming more important in the area. More and more Masons were coming into New Orleans. They were English-speaking York Rite Masons whose Masonic experience was the standard experience outside of Louisiana, which would mainly be an English-speaking lodge and a lodge that worked one of the York Rite rituals, the standard ritual that was worked in the balance of the U.S. Masonic community. And this would mean one Grand Lodge, one language, one ritual. Problem when they would come into Louisiana or New Orleans, they would see lodges working some English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, and several different rites. So not only would they be contending with lodges that were working in a different language, which they may not be familiar with, but it'd be a different ritual, and it was a totally different experience. It caused confusion and it caused problems. The early Grand Lodge seemed to be somewhat at a loss to understand the problem or what could be done to correct it, and its attempt at creating the Chamber of Rites was seen by the Grand Lodge as a logical step to properly control the lodges in a more acceptable manner. For the York Rite Masons, it seemed to make the matters worse for them. They did not want the Grand Lodge to officially adopt additional rituals. They wanted one ritual, one rite. The divisions on the two sides deepened, and soon there was an impasse reached. The Grand Lodge felt that it had been as accommodating as possible to the members coming in from outside Louisiana, but it felt that the masonry that it was practicing was this very same masonry that had been used since the creation of the Grand Lodge. They saw nothing at all wrong with working different Masonic rites or rituals as long as they were in the general category of what they deemed to be Masonic. And these rituals had been worked all over Europe, and they were popular, they were used, and they did not seem to be any problem. On the side of the York Rite English-speaking Masons, they were coming into something that was completely different for them. And so different was it from their other experience or past experience that they felt that they were entering into something that was possibly or probably irregular. In the 1840s, it grew so difficult and impossible for the English-speaking Masons that they petitioned the Grand Lodge of Mississippi. And the Grand Lodge of Mississippi in 1847 declared the Grand Lodge of Louisiana irregular based on the fact that it worked multiple rituals. And 7 lodges were chartered in and around New Orleans area under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Mississippi. These 7 lodges in turn chartered the Louisiana Grand Lodge, ancient York Rite Masons. Grand Lodge of Louisiana immediately declared this an irregular Grand Lodge and broke relations with Mississippi. The balance of the U.S. Masonic community was disturbed by the action of Mississippi, and the only Grand Lodge that recognized this new Grand Lodge in New Orleans was Mississippi. Even though some of the jurisdictions did not approve of working multiple rites, they felt that the Grand Lodge of Mississippi had overstepped its boundaries. Regardless of the situation, it was clear that the English-speaking American influence in New Orleans was going to be the victor. This was part of the United States. The United States was English-speaking, and there was a general feeling that rather than trying to crush or fight this, it should be accepted. In 1850, the 2 Grand Lodges merged, and it was really, rather than a merger, a takeover of the York Rite Grand Lodge, the new Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana kept its name, kept most of its past Grand Masters and such, but the nature of the Grand Lodge changed dramatically. All the lodges that had been issued Scottish Rite or French Rite charters were told to turn in their charters to receive New York Rite charters. A period of anger, upset, disappointment followed over the next 10-20 years. Several lodges left the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and went to the Supreme Council of Louisiana, petitioning them for relief. The back and forth continued for a number of years. In the resulting settlement is what we have today as the 16th District of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. These are the Scottish Rite Lodges. All of them now do work in the Scottish Rite ritual of their choosing. One of the gentlemen agreements that was made between the Grand Lodge and the Scottish Rite Lodges was that the Grand Lodge would refrain from any interference with the ritual worked by these lodges. These 10 lodges, and there was a moratorium on Scottish Rite Lodges until just a few years ago. These lodges would govern themselves. And in the earlier video on Masonic rites, I spoke about how I believe that there were two types of rites, York Rite and Scottish Rite, and the difference was that York Rite was always the same, but Scottish Rite was varied. This is reflective of the 10 Scottish Rite Lodges under the Grand Lodge operating, as far as ritual goes, to something akin to mini Grand Lodges. Just as we go from Grand Lodge to Grand Lodge, and the ritual can vary, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a great deal, so is the ritual within these 10 lodges capable of varying from a slight degree to a more degree. Now, the 16th district that we have today can be looked at in some means as the last vestiges of the old Grand Lodge system. The old system where there was multiple rituals worked, and a lot of this is due to agreements that were worked out between the post-1850 Grand Lodge and the Scottish Rite Lodges and what we have today. Organization of the Scottish Rite Lodges is fairly similar to the York Rite Lodges. I can't go into ritual differences, obviously. These are actual working rituals of the lodges under the Grand Lodge, but we can talk about some of the organizational differences and similarities. In the Scottish Rite Lodges, the positions of Worshipful Master, Junior Warden, and Senior Warden are the same. They remain as in the York Rite Lodges. The positions in a York Rite Lodge, which are known as Senior Deacon and Junior Deacon, they have similar officers in the Scottish Rite Lodges, but they're called by different names. A Senior Deacon is known in the 16th District as Master Expert. Now, in other jurisdictions, he may be known as simply Expert, but in the 16th District is Master Expert. The Junior Deacon, his equivalent, would be the Inner Guard. Now, two other differences. There are two officers which primarily only function is in the opening and closing of the lodges in the Scottish Rite Lodges of the 16th District and under the Supreme Council of Louisiana. These are Senior Deacon and Junior Deacon, but they're not the equivalent officers in the York Rite Lodges. The Senior Deacon sits to the right of the Worshipful Master, and the Junior Deacon sits to the left of the Senior Warden. In other jurisdictions, this was done away with in France prior to 1900, and it was due to some of concerns that Freemasonry was too religious. The word deacon was bothersome, and they did away with the position prior to 1900. Another noticeable difference in a Scottish Rite Lodge in the layout. In the York Rite Lodges, the position of secretary and treasurer. The secretary will be at the Worshipful Master's left hand. The treasurer will be at his right hand. In the Scottish Rite Lodges, the secretary will be at the Worshipful Master's right hand and the treasurer to his left. This is an opposite difference. Now, it's not simply in the Scottish Rite Lodges. In the Valley of New Orleans, the Venerable Master is the equivalent of the Worshipful Master in the Craft Lodge. The secretary for the Valley of New Orleans sits at the right hand of the Venerable Master. The treasurer's station is at his left, exactly as it is in the Scottish Rite Craft Lodges of the 16th District, and exactly opposite of the York Rite Craft Lodges. Now, what I have experienced in valleys outside of New Orleans, a Lodge of Perfection is set up matching the York Rite setup, which would be the secretary to the left and the treasurer to the right. This would be based on, I imagine, the idea that their experience is Craft Lodge Masonry, is York Rite Masonry. Now, I don't know that the Supreme Council has any rules or regulations on where the positions should be, but I find it interesting that in New Orleans, where there are Scottish Rite Craft Lodges, the secretary is to the right, mirroring the workings of a Scottish Rite Craft Lodge, and in other jurisdictions, the secretary would be to the left of the Venerable Master, mirroring the York Rite Craft Lodges, which would be the experience for most everyone outside of the New Orleans area. The comment that I often hear expressed when someone sees the Scottish Rite Craft degrees for the first time is, wow, I wish we had something like this in my jurisdiction. And I believe that the reason for the lack of Scottish Rite Craft Lodges in the different jurisdiction goes back to the long-standing misunderstandings, concerns, and misinformation that has been given about Scottish Rite Craft Lodges. One main misunderstanding that remains is the jurisdiction. As we've mentioned in the previous videos, the 16th District, these Scottish Rite Craft Lodges are under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. They are not under the Southern jurisdiction or under the jurisdiction of any Supreme Council. They are all under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge. Whatever reason a Grand Lodge may or may not choose to work in the Scottish Rite Craft degrees or rituals, or really any ritual, is a choice that each Grand Lodge has to make for itself. Louisiana, from its earliest days, chose to work in multiple rituals. There was a benefit for this. Those who travel to see different lodges, they can see the variance of the Masonic ritual, and they can be exposed to a fuller aspect of Masonry by seeing these different rituals. Another misunderstanding: when you speak of a Scottish Rite Craft Lodge, the term Craft Lodge applies, the term Symbolic Lodge applies to the first 3 degrees, the term Blue Lodge applies. A term that I've heard recently being used more and more in association with the Scottish Rite is Red Lodges or Red Degrees. This is an innovation, and I've researched this quite a bit in the early documents, and all of the very early records and minutes books and rituals, when speaking of the 3 degrees, Craft Lodge is used, Blue Lodge is used, Symbolic Lodge is used. I found no reference to Red Lodges. I suspect it came about by misunderstanding between some of the York Rite degrees and various bodies in the York Rite, but it does not apply to the Scottish Rite Craft Lodges. I appreciate your viewing, your watching. If you have any questions, please send me an email at the email address listed below in the comments. Leave a comment, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be doing a whole series more still to come. And I appreciate everything. Thank you.